Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome back to the Sex and Literature tag. This is an original tag that I'm doing despite my kind of trepidation about doing it. If you're wondering, if you're so uncomfortable about doing this tag, why are you doing it? Why are you making the tag? If you're so uncomfortable, why are you making all of us uncomfortable by watching you do the tag? If you're wondering, it's because my curiosity got the best of me. I've been on BookTube for a little while, and the issue of sex in literature is not something I've seen addressed directly, so I became curious about, how my fellow booktubers react to sex in works of literature. Now, I realize that is a loaded phrase, and I'm not sure, exactly how to define it. But what I would say is that I'm not talking about sex as it's depicted in books that are, clearly books meant to be, interesting for sex reasons only. This might include romance, and in your mind it might not. You can kind of make that judgment for yourself if you decide to do the tag, but I was kind of looking at kind of just literature itself, and kind of curious about what you've noticed, what you think about, the examples you can come up with about the way sex is depicted in literature. So prompt number one. So I was inspired to do this by kind of a coming together of events in January. To begin with, in January, they handed out that kind of sarcastic, satirical prize for the worst depiction of sex in a book. I read the passage that it won the award, and ooh, man, is that terrible. And so I fully appreciate, I didn't want to read the other entries, but I fully accept that that has to be one of the worst descriptions of sex I've ever seen in a book. I'm not going to link to that because, well, for obvious reasons, I'm just not going to. The second reason why I got curious about this is that I read my first Regency romance. This is by Lisa Kleypas. This is Devil's Daughter, which contains some fairly frank and lengthy descriptions of sex and sex scenes, which on some level I really didn't care for, not because they were frank and lengthy, but because there was a little bit too much figurative language, metaphor, euphemism used, and I'll talk about this later, but it didn't exactly, it just wasn't exactly my thing in terms of something I enjoyed reading. It kind of made me cringe a little bit. And then there were two other booktubers who brought up issues in terms of the depiction of sex in literature. One was Sarah from over at Hardcover Hearts. I'll leave a link to her video down below. Mike, please hush. And she brought up the fact that you hardly ever see, actual descriptions of sex between LGBTQ characters, which are, detailed and lengthy, and kind of deal with the issue of sex between those characters in a frank and honest way. And, I agree, and that made me curious. Have I read books that come close to that? Do I have those books on my shelf? That was one of the things that drove my interest. And then Juan over at Bookish Islander, in his review of, I believe it's Cleanliness, or maybe it's Cleanness, I'll leave a link to his video down below, just kind of talked about how he doesn't necessarily like the graphic depiction of sex in books. And that kind of brought all this up. What do we think? What have we read? In terms of depictions of sex, and kind of what, where do we draw the line? What do we think is good? What do we think is cringy? What do we think is pornography? Those kinds of things. So I just came up with a series of prompts designed to embarrass me by asking, and hopefully not make you too awkward in terms of my asking. So prompt number one, can you name the literary book that you've read that comes closest to crossing that line between literature or even just adult fiction and pornography? And I've mentioned this book on my channel several times. That will be Vox by Nicholson Baker. Nicholson Baker gets kind of obsessed with certain topics, and then he writes about them in usually relatively slim books. He's an interesting writer, somebody whose writing I've enjoyed. This book, the issue he focuses on is essentially media depictions of sex and pornography and their effect on people's ideas about sex and relationships. And the sex in here, while I think still maintaining the kind of or of literature can be quite graphic and direct, and there's a lot of it. So that to me comes about as close to that, crossing that line between the two, as anything I think I've ever read. He did write another book after this called Fermata, which I believe many critics think was just actual pornography. Prompt number 2, the cringiest sex you've ever seen depicted or described or talked about in a book. I'm just going to go with Ernest Hemingway and For Whom the Bell Tolls and the descriptions of sex between Robert Jordan and Maria. While I think they're intended to be romantic, and I can see a certain kind of naive beauty to them, the discussion about how this fixes Maria and how it restores Maria to who she really was after being the victim of repeated rapes is just cringy, and I think it is not good Hemingway. By the way, I'd also include some scenes from Hemingway's Garden of Eden as fairly cringy depictions of sex. Prompt number 3, most overrated work of literature that people associate with books about sex. I'm going to go with Tropic of Cancer by Henry Miller, which I read, which, you know, for many people was this kind of revolutionary book which talked frankly about sex, and people apparently found it sexy. I did not. And not to sound, you know, squeamish, but I just wanted everybody to take a shower, maybe, not necessarily a cold shower, but a shower and calm down. I didn't think the books were that great. I just didn't think it was nearly as great or even as sexy as it was supposed to be. I read half of Tropic of Capricorn thinking, well, maybe I got the wrong one. And then fortunately I was spared from reading the rest of the half because I lost that book somewhere. I think on public transportation. I'm not exactly sure where I lost it. Prompt number 5 is, do you have a favorite depiction of sex in a book? And I realize this is problematic, and I'm going to take the easy way out and the easiest one, but it happens to be true, and that comes from the Molly Bloom as Penelope section of Ulysses, which I know there's a big, huge group reading going on right now of Ulysses, involving a number of booktubers who I may in fact tag to do this video here at the end. But her description essentially of her decision to lose her virginity in her youth, I've always found to be really effective and a great use of kind of stream of consciousness, by the way, maybe one of the best, which, by the way, also apparently the makers of Back to School, starring Rodney Dangerfield, agreed with. So I'm going to read that exact passage. And Gibraltar as a girl, for I was a flower of the mountain, yes, but I put the rose in my hair like the Andalusian girls used. Or shall I wear red? Yes, and how he kissed me under the Moorish wall, and I thought, well, as well him as another. And then I asked him with my eyes to again yes, and then he asked me would I, yes, to say yes, my mountain flower. And first I put my arms around him, yes, and drew him down to me so he could feel my breast, all perfume, yes, and his heart was going like mad. And yes, I said yes, I will, yes. Anyway, it's classic, and maybe that's a cop-out on my part, the guy making the video, but I've always thought of that as a fairly beautiful passage. Prompt number 5 is, can you think of a book you read recently that just has a positive depiction of sex, in which sex is used, described, alluded to in a way which you thought was just absolutely right, and at no moment did that make you cringy? And I'm going to go with Valerie Luiselli's Lost Children Archive, where there's not really a lot of sex. Trust me when I say there's not a lot of sex in this book. But the description of sex and the sexual tension and feeling between the two main characters, a husband and a wife, and that kind of sexual chemistry and sexual tension that can exist in a relationship which is, you know, into its 4th or 5th year, I just thought was really well handled. And despite the fact that that couple is going through some problems, I thought there was a certain kind of beauty to the way it was described. And then kind of getting to what Sarah was getting at, you know, is, you know, have you read depictions of sexual relationships between LGBTQ plus characters that you thought were were well handled. Now, I think she was going for something along the lines of the sex actually being described in some detail, and I don't really have an example of that, and I think that kind of proves her point that she was making the video. But I have read some books in the last, I don't know, well, in the last 5-6 years, I guess, maybe longer, which I think deal with the issue of sex between LGBTQ plus characters and relationships between those characters in ways which I found to be somewhat moving and beautiful. First, I'm going to go with Sarah Gailey's Hippoduology. This is Volume 2, A Taste of Marrow. These books depict a romance and sexual relationship between a gay male character and a non-binary character. And he and they have a really, what I think, considering the violence, the fun, and the adventure of the book, have an incredibly sweet romantic story, which occasionally includes depictions of, I'm going to at least say, sexual touching and kissing, which I found to be very well handled and one of the more charming aspects of these books. I also remembered that a long time ago I'd read The Mysteries of Pittsburgh by Michael Chabon, which was his first novel, in which his main character, who, you know, is, I suppose, like in many American men's first novel, is a stand-in for himself. His main character is bisexual and has a relationship with a man, at least one man and a woman going on more or less at the same time. And, you know, my memory of this is that those sexual relationships, and particularly the sexual relationship between the main character and a man named Arthur, were handled really frankly and directly, with no judgment, no negatives associated with it. I don't remember if the sex was described particularly specifically, but I do remember thinking that it was kind of unusual to find somebody treating this as though it were just as normal as we should think of it, you know, as though it were just a regular part of life, which of course it is. And so I found that to be fairly refreshing. And then if you haven't read this book and you've only heard about it from by reputation, Black Leopard, Red Wolf by Marlon James is one of my top 10 books from last year. And I think this book just has an incredibly beautiful love story. Actually kind of two love stories that sort of overlap between the main character who's called Tracker and a man who he falls in love with, who, you know, at one point was his enemy, which I realize is kind of a romance novel trope, but who then have a real relationship, a real loving and sexual relationship. Of the three books, I think this is the one which describes sex in the most direct and graphic terms. So those are my three examples of books which I think feature sex between LGBTQ plus characters that features positively in all three of the stories. By the way, it's not that their relationships are perfectly, you know, settled and not stormy and not without trouble. In Black Leopard, Red Wolf, Tracker is a deeply scarred, flawed person who would not have been easy to have a relationship with. I'm not saying that there are these perfect love story type things, but I do think that they are positive, which, you know, for so long was impossible in literature, and I think that this is a good thing. You know, you may have read these and gotten a different impression from that than I did, which you can, you know, feel free to comment on. And then my last prompt, before I get to tagging a whole lot of people to make them, and hopefully not making them feel awkward or uncomfortable, my last prompt is to just kind of basically describe, you know, how you like for sex to be handled in a work of literature, or in a work of fiction, or in a work of adult fiction, even in romance or science fiction, or wherever you may find it. To be honest with you, my default setting is that descriptions of sex in books are rarely necessary. However, having said that, I think I agree with Sarah's point that that there needs to be a more willingness by publishers to publish books with graphic descriptions of sex between LGBTQ plus characters. That would be, you know, bring everything up to being equal. They should be as willing to publish that as they are to, you know, publish stories with graphic depictions of sex between men and women characters. But my default is that I just think sex is almost always handled poorly in literature and fiction. It is a very difficult thing to write about. It's been a difficult thing for me to craft these prompts about, and I'm not sure I succeeded in not making this cringy even then. Just kind of, where do you stand on the issue of depictions of sex, any kind of sex, between any kinds of characters or people? Where do you stand on depictions of that in literature? You know, is it something you like? Is it something that makes you cringe no matter what? Is it something you think can be handled well? And then to give us examples. You know, one of the prompts is to give an example of that. Anyway, so here I go. I'm going to tag some people. So, Steve Donahue, you're tagged because you always want to be tagged, and I don't want you to be self-conscious about your smell. So I'm tagging you, Steve Donahue. Mark Nash, I'm tagging you. Sean the Book Maniac, you're tagged. Fellas over at Codex Cantina, Crypto and Una, you're tagged. Also want to tag Kazan from Always Doing, Sarah from Hardcover Hearts, obviously Hannah from Hannah's Books, Britta Bowler. I want to see your opinions on this tag, and then anybody else who, you know, oh, Juan from Bookish Islander, obviously you're one of the inspirations of the tag, so I want you to do the tag as well. So and anybody else who wants to do the tag, who feels comfortable doing this, please do the tag. I really am, I think, legitimately curious, and I don't think my curiosity is prurient in its nature, even though, you know, with the depths of the human mind, it's sometimes hard to tell. Anyway, so let me know what you think about the tag. If you're going to do the tag, in the comments section below, let me know if you think the tag was an incredibly bad idea. If I discussed any of the prompts in ways that were offensive, please let me know right away. It's not my intention to be offensive in any way, shape, or form. As always, look forward to all your comments in the comments section below, and thank you for watching.